The United States Supreme Court has handed down a massive, unanimous 9-0 decision that fundamentally changes when law enforcement can march right through your front door without a warrant. If you think your home is completely protected, you need to watch out because the Supreme Court recently delivered a massive warning for property owners nationwide. In a critical lawsuit, the Supreme Court was forced to confront a dangerous loophole regarding how lower courts evaluate emergency entries into your home. The state courts tried to create a loose framework that would have completely vaporized your privacy protections. The Supreme Court stepped in to issue a massive correction, but inside that 9-0 ruling is actually a hidden trap that everyday Americans need to be aware of. We need to break down what exactly the Supreme Court did and the alarming reality of how this impacts your rights immediately. Now, before we jump into what the Supreme Court did in this ruling, if you like this type of content and you want to make sure you get it going forward, make sure to subscribe to the channel and also turn on all notifications to make sure you never miss this information when I release it. I also want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is Attorneys on Retainer. When it comes to self-defense protection, in my opinion, AOR is in a league of their own. They're backed by an actual law firm, the Attorneys for Freedom, and they're always trying to expand upon their benefits to give you as much as possible as a member. And right now, if you decide to sign up and you use my exclusive code ARMSCHOLAR, for a limited time, you can get $50 off of your individual sign-up fee or $25 off the family sign-up fee. Now, to understand the impact of what just happened, we have to look at the unsettling facts that actually triggered this battle in the first place. It all started when police received a report regarding alleged threatening statements made by an individual, Trevor Case. The call was made to 911 by Trevor's ex-girlfriend, and when talking to the police, she admitted that she could not remember exactly what he said, but she told the officers that she had a bad feeling and warned them that he may be dangerous. There were 4 police officers that arrived at his home. All of them actually knew Mr. Case. They had a history with him, and they also knew his history, and he had a history of kind of mental health issues. They looked through the windows and they saw nobody inside the home, but they did notice, at least one of the officers noticed, that there was an empty holster and a notepad. Now, here's where things kind of unraveled and created this case. The police did not immediately rush into the home. Instead, they stood outside for about 40 minutes. Some officers openly stated that they did not think that Trevor had it in him to do anything wrong, but after about 40 minutes, they discovered that the front door was completely unlocked, and so they decided to go into the home without a warrant. As one of the officers searched the upstairs bedroom, he saw a closet curtain kind of suddenly jerk open, and inside was Trevor Case, and he saw his face, and he saw what he believed was a black object, and so he panicked and opened fire on Trevor Case. He hit him in the arm, and then it passed through the arm and went into his stomach. Now, afterwards, when the police had detained Trevor Case, they searched the room and they found a weapon in a nearby laundry basket. Now, in response to this incident, Trevor Case fought back against some of the charges that were brought against him, demanding that this warrantless entry and evidence needed to be suppressed under the 4th Amendment. Now, this case eventually made its way all the way up to the Montana Supreme Court, who ultimately rejected those arguments of Trevor Case in a 4-3 split decision. That then led this case to go up to the Supreme Court for review. Now, when this challenge reached the Supreme Court, it did trigger a massive institutional clash. Mr. Case argued that the 4th Amendment requires strict probable cause before police can execute an emergency aid entry into the home, and he pointed out that the Supreme Court had already struck down this broad type of community caretaking exceptions in the landmark Supreme Court case Coniglia versus Strom. But here's also the wild part of this case. Both the state of Montana and the Trump administration stepped into this fight actively arguing for a much lower standard of review. In fact, the Trump administration explicitly asked the Supreme Court to approve a sliding scale of reasonable suspicion to give officers this type of broad leeway to bypass warrants in these types of emergency situations. Now, when the final ruling of the Supreme Court dropped, it was a total 9-0 shutout. The Supreme Court completely rejected the Trump administration and Montana's push for a loose reasonable suspicion framework, calling it way too weak to protect the actual home rights. But the justices also completely rejected Mr. Case's argument, ruling that probable cause is strictly tied to criminal investigations and doesn't apply to life-saving interventions. Instead, the Supreme Court reaffirmed the court's prior standard from Brigham City versus Stewart, which states that police do not need a warrant or probable cause if they have an objectively reasonable basis to believe that an occupant is seriously injured or facing imminent harm. Applying that standard to these exact facts, the Supreme Court ruled that because the officers heard a report that a weapon may be actually involved, they saw an empty holster, and they got no response from anyone in the home, and they believed that maybe he had harmed himself or was potentially going to harm himself, they had an objectively reasonable basis to think that they needed to enter the home to help Mr. Case. The Supreme Court emphasized that the Fourth Amendment does not require police to stand by and do nothing when a human life is at risk. The Supreme Court stated in this opinion that, "We repeat today what we have held before. An officer may enter a home without a warrant if he has an objectively reasonable basis for believing that an occupant is seriously injured or imminently threatened with such injury." The officer's entry satisfied that test according to the Supreme Court. So in essence, the Supreme Court upheld the ultimate conclusion of the Montana Supreme Court, but rejected the analysis that they used to reach that conclusion. So reasonable suspicion was too loose of an analysis, and instead the Supreme Court applies the objectively reasonable test. They also rejected Mr. Case's position that probable cause should be the actual test. The Supreme Court found that that test is too strong and would prevent police from performing necessary life-saving duties. So what is the ultimate conclusion here with this issue? The Supreme Court technically upheld the final judgment against Mr. Case, but they completely threw out and rejected the legal analysis that the Montana Supreme Court used to actually get there. While they stopped the lower courts from expanding upon that loose, watered-down caretaker standard, they officially solidified a nationwide rule. If law enforcement can point to a credible report involving an objectively reasonable belief, they can ultimately go through your front door, use that workaround, and they can enter your home without a warrant under this type of belief that they're engaging in this objectively reasonable belief and basis that you are potentially going to harm yourself or someone else is going to be harmed, and therefore they need to go in. That is the hidden reality behind this unanimous 9-0 decision in Case versus Montana. The loose standards were in fact rejected, but the new framework leaves a massive, unprecedented battlefield at your actual doorstep. There's no doubt going forward that there's going to be massive fallout from this ruling on pending cases across the country, and I will actually be tracking those closely to see, how does this play out and how does this ruling by the Supreme Court impact some of these other types of cases. So if you want to stay ahead of how this plays out and you want to get updates on this topic and other topics as well, make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and also make sure you turn on all notifications to make sure you never miss these updates. Also, let me know what you think about this ruling by the Supreme Court down below. Do you think that they got it right? Or do you think that they're giving too much power and leeway to law enforcement to enter your home without a warrant simply based on an objectively reasonable belief? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comment section. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.